you guys ever wonder about sound? I mean, sound in movies, sound in TV shows, not just music in the background or the fact that, hey, how come I can't hear the dialogue? I mean, sound overall as a sophisticated, nuanced narrative tool. How does that all work? So I thought it would be great just to have Jacob on and we could kibitz about the art of being a sound editor and what that really means. So as a kid growing up in New York, did you first encounter like the idea of like sound?
Right.
Was it like, were you a music fan? Were you a fan of movies? Or like, how does one even start as somebody who becomes a sound editor?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's pretty much my whole life would be the answer to that question. Especially my upbringing and my life as a child and as an adolescent. I mean, so the roots answer to that for me would be my parents. My parents were into the arts, and so much of that was music and acting and films, and they loved films. My mother was from Morocco, and she had an education in Paris before she came to this country. In fact, my first language before I learned English was French, and so, and she was a great reader and thinker and lover of movies. And my parents would go and see the latest Godard and Truffaut movies when I was a kid.
And you grew up in Manhattan, right?
I grew up in Manhattan.
Yep.
And so one of the things that was pretty prevalent when I was a kid was this revival of showing all the great silent comedies of, Chaplin, Keaton, Harold Lloyd, Harry Langdon, Max Sennett, and on and on, It just so happened that we used to go to my grandfather's house in New London, Connecticut for the summers. And one summer I show up and there's a new kid. I was 11 years old, a new kid in the neighborhood. And he had this hobby, and his hobby was to collect silent comedies on Super 8 and Regular 8. And he would collect them. And then he would drop this was not long after The Sting had come out, and there was this resurgence in people listening to ragtime music, Scott Joplin, et cetera.
Yeah.
So the routine was to put on a record and put on the movie and play the ragtime along with the movie. So we started doing this together, and meanwhile, there was a company out in Davenport, Iowa, Black Hawk Films, that we would order these movies from, and it was really exciting, to get one of these in the mail.
So this is like way before video cassettes. This is
way before, yes. There was no such thing.
So this is the only way in which you can actually see these things, unless you randomly happen to on the Late Late Show or something like that on TV.
Right. Or if you lived in New York and you had the Museum of Modern Art and you had, I used to go to the Museum of Modern Art all the time, and they had a house piano player that would play along to all the silent films. And I used to do things like, this was all the way through high school. I used to organize my weekends so that you would have I would look, okay, Carnegie Hall Cinema is playing this double feature and it's over at X time, and if I run 10 blocks to the Museum of Modern Art or whatever, I could get to this other movie. And I used to do things like that. I'd get out of one movie and then run to go see another movie. So, there was a in all this revival of the music and the cinema, I did have a model to sort of draw from of, these silent movies, and I saw silent movies features. I mean, what we were collecting were mostly the shorts. Right. So these would be like what they used to call one-reelers or two-reelers. Two-reelers like 25 minutes, one-reelers like 10, 15 minutes. So And then I used to play them at birthday parties for kids. And then I had this experience. I started experimenting with my parents' record collection. And one day I put on The Immigrant, Charlie Chaplin's short, along with Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, just to see like what would happen, you know?
Just totally random
Yeah,
pairing.
just randomly, you know, it's just like, well, let's see, let's like try to put some other music besides the usual ragtime. And I was flabbergasted to find that the music went with the film so well, and it just connected with the film in a completely different way. And it brought out everything besides the comedy that was emotional, dramatic, the pathos, whatever you want to call it, that exists in that film and that exists in Chaplin as a performer and what he brings. And so it brought out other aspects of the movie. So, you know, that was a really cool experience. But you know, I'm like 11, 12 years old. I had no clue. It's not like it was at that point that I said, oh, I want to become a sound editor. You know, I didn't know anything about that. And I went through high school and went through college. And it wasn't until, and I had you know, to answer this original questions, there were things that I was really interested in. Acting, I did some acting and in my junior high, kind of eighth grade, we did a graduation play and we chose The Crucible, and I was John Proctor, and we had a great one of the teachers, one of my classmates' parents was an actor, and she borrowed costumes from Shakespeare in the Park and modified them and turned, you know, cut the play down by half. So that was an experience I had. When I got to college, I did some more acting, but meanwhile, I was doing some writing. I thought maybe I would write screenplays or something, you know,
Yeah.
when I got to college, but I didn't end up doing that.
What about
Um,
music? Are you like you mentioned your parents having like a big collection, and you know my father's family was from the Upper West Side, and I remember things like bookshelves and record shelves being, you know, just sort of ubiquitous in all of my relatives and their friends' houses. And then there's a certain ceremony to, oh well, you got to be really careful if you touch the records,
right.
and was that the case with in your experience as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There definitely music was a big part of it. My father, it actually started with my grandmother on my father's side when I was in that same house that we would go to, that my grandfather's house when I was real young, like 4 years old, 3 years old. She would sit at the piano and she would play. She would say, okay, this is a gallop and you're going to gallop. And she'd play some piece of music that would be a gallop. And I go galloping around the living room. And then she'd say, okay, now this is a skip. This is a hop. This is a jump. And I would shift into these different kinds of movement according to what she played. So she really was the first influence musically. Ironically, you know, this was my grandfather was a United States senator.
Mhm.
So he had a staff of folks working for him in this house. And I really connected with a woman who was, you know, one of the, like, she probably was like the head, you know, person who kept the house in order,
Yep.
Dolores. And she was African American.
Mhm.
And there was this, she started to play me and teach me about the dances of that time, like the funky chicken or, you know, or the twist or whatever it was, and and play me the music. And I really connected to the music. So that was soul and R&B of the late 60s, of the mid 60s, actually, mid to late. So that began a whole long journey for me of listening to Black music, which really took over my life. And it got to where, you know, once I had a radio and discovered, like, I used to drive around with my dad or with my parents and listen to Top 40, WABC, listen to that in the car, but always gravitate towards the Otis Redding, you know, and the Sly and the Family Stone
Yep.
and those. And then finally, when I got a hold of a radio myself and I started to just, you know, fiddle around with the dial, I discovered that way up at the top of the dial were these Black radio stations. So, you know, WLIB on AM, WBLS on FM. Then in the 70s, you know, there was WRVR, which was this jazz fusion station, which was around for a while. So I just got so immersed in all of that. And that kind of eventually became, my father said I started by learning the piano, but my piano lessons kind of stalled out after a few years. And so we stopped doing that. And my dad said, look, you want to play an instrument, you come to me, tell me what instrument you want to play. And but you really have to want to do it. I don't want to have to force you to take, to practice and everything. So I was conflicted between the trumpet and the saxophone. And I finally said, the saxophone. My dad took me, we used to go to see jazz concerts at the Church of the Heavenly Rest on 90th Street and Fifth Avenue near where we lived. And he took me to see Dexter Gordon, who had just come back in the mid 70s to the United States from living as an expat in Europe for a long time. And that blew me away. Dexter Gordon, his sound, his big sound filling up the church. So that was the beginning. So I said to my dad, oh, saxophone, I'm going to learn how to play the saxophone. And so that was a long, process of playing the saxophone, learning jazz, learning how to improvise. When I got to college, I had my own radio station. And one of my favorite players as an alto player was Jackie McLean. And so eventually in college, he was at the University of Hartford, teaching at the Hart School of Music. And I got in touch with him and I said, could I interview you? And he said, yeah, sure. So, he was great. I went to interview him. I brought my boombox, which had a mic in it back then. That was like, early 80s, and did this interview. He let me sit in on some classes he was teaching. And he said, have you ever done an interview before? And I said, no. And he said, all right, don't worry. I'll tell you what to ask me. So, he was great. And then I took the interview and I, kind of cut it up and, did the thing of playing parts of the interview and then going into his music and played that on my radio show. So that was a huge, that was very inspirational. But when I finally graduated from Amherst, and I thought my first priority was to become a jazz musician. And I called him up, and he knew that my grandfather was Abraham Ribicoff, who had been senator in Connecticut and had a long, my grandfather had held every office in Connecticut, governor, senator, you name it, right? So I called up Jackie McLean and I said, this is it. I'm playing the saxophone. And he went off on me. He said, what are you doing playing the saxophone? He said, he said, your grandfather, is Abraham Ribicoff. You should be going into politics. You should become a lawyer. Don't play the saxophone. But all of that is to say that somewhere in all of that, I know this is a very long answer to your question, but these are all kind of formative experiences, and they all have to do with music. Or as I began to notice that there was something called a sound editor, I said, oh, that's a career, sound editor. Okay. And I started doing things on my own. Like I would sit in a park, for example, and just take notes as to what I was hearing. Like, okay, I'm sitting here. What am I hearing? I'm hearing some like this distant, like this continuous bed of some din of traffic. Okay, that's a sound. I hear kids. Okay, that's a sound. I hear birds. That's a sound. And I started kind of basically like just in terms of listening and thinking and being conscious of what sound exists in the world in any given location. Again, not realizing that what I was doing, I was already sound editing, just on paper.
Yeah.
So that was another kind of thing that I started doing. And all of these different things pointed towards this very real career in what eventually became known as sound design. That really wasn't a term that was operational when I first started. And you had sound editing and sound mixing were completely separated, whereas now they're very much mixed together. And, I myself have done a lot of projects where I've been the re-recording mixer and the sound designer, and had a team working with me, but kind of oversaw all of that. I started out doing some location sound, but I wanted the experience to be, I wanted to be able to work with the director and the picture editor in a creative way.
Well,
So,
well, I want to know about that, and I want to like have you break it down. But just let's think back to the late '80s or the early '90s when you're going into the film business. A couple of things. Can you, first of all, just for a general audience member, can you sort of tell us what the difference is between somebody that's recording the sound while a movie's being filmed,
mhm.
and then the sound department that comes in as part of post-production, and then what the different elements or components of that sound, that bigger sound department are?
Right, sure. So the location mixer, whose job it is to record the dialogue as the film is being shot, and that person's sole job, is to make the cleanest recordings of all the dialogue for every take during the shooting of the movie. And it's a really hard job because you have to battle as the location mixer. You're battling blocking and lighting, and you could get your boom in a perfect position, but if you put your boom in that position, it's going to cast a shadow on the actors. So you have to be very resourceful. You also have body mics which can rub against clothing, so you have to come up with ways of getting a clean recording with a body mic, planting mics in flower pots or on dashboards or whatever. So it's a hard job.
What's the personality type of somebody that does that job? Is it like a librarian?
No,
The old
no, you're a
stereotype of a
gadfly. I mean, those people can be reviled on the set because they're always trying to, because they're not really being considered. Their priority, even though it is a priority for the director, it doesn't announce itself as a priority on set. So they're kind of pushy, trying to get the best recording, but knowing that they're always going to it's an uphill battle all the time. And then at the end of the day, you take all your work and you just hand it over. You say goodbye to back then it was tapes, but now it's just like a files. And that's it. Um, so that's the job of the location mixer. It's a very difficult job, and it's very difficult to do well. And it's easy, then the next thing that happens, let's just say, is you get into the audio or the sound post of a film, which is what I'm in. So we, now you're starting post, you're meeting with the director and the picture editor. You have what's called a spotting session, which is like a meeting where you watch the film or the episodic and you discuss the elements of sound that you're going to put together.
Mhm.
And so there are different kind of categories or departments within post-production audio for film and episodic and documentaries. You have a dialogue editor, and dialogue editor's job is to take all that dialogue that was recorded by the location mixer and really clean it up. And we have great tools nowadays, applications or plugins, programs that can filter out anything. It can even separate an instrument away from a voice. So the dialogue editor's job is to take care of all of that. Then relating to the words of a movie, you have an ADR editor, and the ADR editor's job is to work along with the director to re-record some parts of the actor's performances. And on every project, there's either more or less of that going on. And that's where, for example, for technical reasons, let's say there was a plane going by during a certain take, or there was a generator or an air conditioner or something that was on that really mars the dialogue recording. You may have to go back into the studio, bring the actor back to redo their lines, or the lines can be redone for the purpose of changing the performance, which is also done. The director may decide, I want the performance to be more urgent, more sympathetic, more whatever. Also, there can be also what happens is doing lines that are off camera that will expand on the plot, that will offer either. I worked on one movie, which was a comedy, Failure to Launch, where they seemed like they wanted to add more jokes. Like they came up with one-liners and things like to add in off camera, just to make things more jokey than they already were. So it's a chance to add little deep plot points and details. You can do that off camera with ADR. And ADR stands for automated dialogue replacement. And it has to do with the system that existed at the beginning that doesn't anymore. But there's a system of beeps by which an actor is in the studio watching the movie in front of them, and then there are beeps counting down to when they're supposed to come in with their line in sync with the movie.
Wow.
So that's
so they're lip syncing to improve or to add part of their performance. And so does that mean that the ADR editor is almost like sort of a movie director in their own way, right? Because they're working with the actors.
Yeah, they can be. Sometimes the director is part of that session, in which case the director will take over those duties of kind of any sort of direction. And the ADR editor will be there for more of a technical kind of input. But there are other times when the director is not around and the ADR editor needs to kind of step up and become a director. And it's tricky because actors can be very ornery or prickly about coming back to have to get back into character, to redo lines. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. And some of them are better at it and more willing than others, and I've been on jobs where we've gone to great pains to preserve the original, on the hours, for example. There was this scene, I think is it Meryl Streep, who's like, she's kind of has broken down and she's sitting against a dishwasher. And I think the dishwasher was on or something was going on. There was noise and it's a very emotional performance. And there's like this sort of cyclical sound, or maybe it was the camera. The cameras used to make more noise. Whatever it was there, and it was a problem. Like you could hear that. But they really didn't want her to have to redo her dialogue. So the dialogue editor had to literally, and this was kind of before, I guess we were already into digital at that point, but early days, and had to get in there with a scalpel and just cut out all the sound in between the words and just leave the words and cut out all the tone, every pause, everything in between the words to try to minimize this extraneous sound that was there. So, but that would be a time when you would often do ADR as well.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and then what about like background, like if you're in a courtroom scene or like a crowd or a restaurant or something like that? Right. Is that part of what the ADR editor does too? Yeah.
So an offshoot of that would be loop group. So you'll have oftentimes the ADR editor will also be the loop group editor. Loop group is great because loop group is where you bring a group of actors.
They're actors, right? They're not like just
they're SAG actors, union actors. You bring them into the studio to recreate the crowd, because usually the crowds are, when you film a movie, the crowds are told to just pantomime talking. They're not actually talking, so you can get a cleaner recording of the principal actors. So you're bringing in groups of actors to recreate crowds, like it could be a restaurant, or it could be a doctor's office, or it could be a sporting event, or you name it, anything that has a crowd in it, for specific reactions, like crowd reactions to anything. Some event occurs and it's one of joy or a great disappointment or whatever. You want that crowd reaction. I just worked on a movie that came out in 25, Song Blue, and we had a lot of opportunities. Well, there were sing-alongs in that. So that's, Neil Neil Diamond's music, and there are crowds singing along to it's a husband and wife team that are doing his music and traveling around playing his music as a revival act. And so sing-alongs for that, but also like where a crowd in the restaurant may react, or in performance, there may be laughter. You don't want to use canned laughter. You want it to be real.
Yeah.
So you just think of like any instance in which it's a crowd reacting in some way,
Yeah.
and you want to get if you want to really tailor that sound again, to have the director involved, maybe, to make it sound as much as possible like reality,
Yeah.
even though it is with actors, and that's the wrestle sometimes, like, trying to get the actors to sound real.
Yeah.
And so that's why.
So, okay, so those are the components of dialogue, just
Right.
of what we're. So then next you're dealing with, well, I guess obviously music is a big component, right?
Yes. Right.
And so that could be either, well, there's somebody who's going to either be a composer, and then so what, a music editor deals with the
Yes.
composer or picks out the source music?
Yeah, so you'll have a music editor for sure, who deals with all the editing of all the music, whether it's the composer's music or the source music, like famous songs that are being used in the movie.
Yeah.
Works with the director and the picture editor to, either sometimes to help brainstorm on that stuff. You'll have a music supervisor who knows all the kind of Byzantine legal world of licensing music to use it in a movie. The music can be very expensive. Music can, groups or estates, like Jimi Hendrix estate or whatever,
Led
can be
Zeppelin.
very particular about where their music is used.
Yeah.
I worked on a Wes Anderson movie, Darjeeling Limited, where they were going to use the Beatles music, and I had even cut, and it seemed like a lock, like they had already done their homework. They were going to get this music, and there was one scene with a railroad train, and they're running after the train, and I can't remember the Beatles song, but it was really like rhythmic, and I cut all these, like the sounds of the train clacks to the rhythm of the music, and I spent a long time cutting it so it would fit and be almost like a seamless part of the music, only to find out at the end that they couldn't get the rights to all this music. We couldn't use any of that. And they instead got the Kinks, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and it was not like I couldn't do the same thing I had done for that scene, with the rhythmic. It just didn't lend itself.
Yeah.
So, this is part of what we do in terms of, I think, you have to be, so, I mean, to get back to your question, let me just stay on track with that. So you have sound design, you have sound effects editors,
So then there's sound effect, right, sound effects.
You have backgrounds editors, and you have Foley editors. So sound effects is the hard sounds like, gunshots, vehicle sounds for car chases, explosions, maybe doors, like things that are a little more mundane, but even a door sound,
What about if I had would that include like a coffee mug that I put on the table?
a coffee mug that would be Foley. So Foley is where, if it's an action that's kind of an extension of human movement, like footsteps, or putting a coffee mug down on a table, then that's Foley. And Foley is sort of like the movement equivalent to ADR, where you're also in a studio and you're recording in sync to the picture. And you have someone called a Foley artist or a Foley walker, whose job and whose sole purpose in life is to create these sounds in sync with the movie. And it's amazing what they can do. And they build up props. They go through their lives, hunting for props to use to create sounds. And
so they're human sound effects machines, essentially.
They are, exactly. That's great. They're human sound effects machines. And
so this is like, I remember at Sound One, the Foley artists would be like these middle-aged dudes, and they'd have, like just walls and walls of different women's high-heeled shoes,
Right.
and they'd have different kinds of surfaces that they would be walking on to create these effects of. A lot of times, I just thought of Foley artists as footsteps, but it's so much more than that, isn't it?
Right. It's for storytelling. It's for creating, extending a visceral feeling that that you want to put out there to sort of. I mean, look, movies are all about being larger than life in terms of any aspect of a story about human beings, right?
Mm.
So you decide, you whatever the story is, that human, that character being portrayed by that actor needs to be as vivid as possible and as palpable to the viewer as possible. And Foley is a way of underscoring that palpability, that visceral, so you'll do footsteps on grass, even though in real life, when you walk on grass, it makes no sound at all.
Totally.
There are sounds that are created that for things that we don't even really hear, but we do hear them in the movies.
You mean
Um,
like those kinds of sounds, like when people are eating and you're hearing the sort of like hyper
oh my
slurping or
God.
hyper tinkly kind of thing?
It's funny that you talk about that. I was just before, like an hour ago, speaking to George Lara, who's a Foley engineer, Foley mixer, and every Foley artist works with a Foley mixer. There's one great Foley person in New York, Rachel Chancey, and she actually records and walks and does everything herself. But I was talking to George and remembering I was a Foley editor on The Aviator, and there's a scene between Leonardo DiCaprio and Alan Alda, and they're sitting eating a meal like in a club or something, and they're eating fish. And I had to cut the sounds of them eating this fish. And it's just like they had done every minute mouth sound you could possibly imagine. And it was like for a day or two, I was living inside their mouths. And I had like way too much material. And I had to figure out as an editor, okay, what do I include? What do I not include? How do I do this? And then add to that, the glasses and the forks and the knives and the plates. So we get into all this minutia, and then it's kind of our job, especially my job as the person that oversees the whole thing, to make a lot of editorial decisions about what to include and what not to include.
Right, because
So
and obviously some of it is subjective, but you could say, wow, the fidelity to realistic sounds there help bring you in the scene, or they could bring you out of the scene because they're calling attention to itself and distracting you from whatever the narrative of the scene is.
right. Exactly. And I think you want to find that balance where, if to take that same exact example, it's a period piece, The Aviator, and however it is that they're dressed, their costume design
Yeah.
is bringing you in to the movie. And so this is a sonic equivalent to the costume design. It has to be exactly right for the period, but also for, the storytelling and the dramatic purposes that are in play at that moment in the movie.
So interesting. So Jacob, like when you're working, whether it's a television series or a feature film, do you get a sense that the filmmakers, let's say the director in this case, usually, do they have a sense of what they're looking for sonically, or are they just like, yeah, make it sound like this. I don't know how to do it, but make it sound like that. Or are they coming in with like a pretty clear idea, and then your job is to try to give them all of the resources to help follow that through and realize that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the case. They do it's amazing the degree to which most filmmakers that I've worked with have a very specific idea. And sometimes it's true they don't know how to kind of proactively or forwardly articulate what they want.
Yep.
But, part of the way we communicate is I will do a spec version of a scene and then have them listen to it. And that gets a dialogue going because then they'll say, oh, no, this is definitely, I don't want this and I don't want that. And sometimes, their reaction against something is as valuable as their ability to say, I want this or that because they may not know. There was Manchester by the Sea working with Kenny Lonergan on that one. For example, there's a scene where there's a group playing ping pong in their basement. And I had like 5 different recordings of people playing ping pong and from library, from different sources. And there was one to me which felt like the quintessential sound of ping pong. Like, right, you think of ping pong and immediately you have a sound in your head. Everyone will, of what that sounds like. So I cut that in and I played it for him. And he said, that sound of the ping pong you put in there, that's really weird. It doesn't really sound like ping pong to me. And so I said, okay, well, I have these other recordings. And there was one of the 5 recordings I had, there was one that to me sounded totally off. It didn't sound to me like ping pong at all. And I played all the recordings and he said, oh, that's the one. And it was the one that to me I thought sounded off. To him, that was like the quintessential sound of ping pong. So it only, that just goes to show you the subjectivity, the degree to which all of this perception of sound is so incredibly subjective, and why we have to work collaboratively. Because if someone were to tell me just go off and do what I think is just make it sound good, inevitably, I mean, I think I've gotten that from people at times, if not for the whole project, for a scene or something, and I do what I think is appropriate and sounds good, they'll come back and say, no, that I want to go in a different direction. There has to be room for some trial and error and and my job is to try to read as many clues from the film itself, from my discussions with the filmmaker, to glean as many clues as I can to get a sense of what their sensibility is, what their aesthetic is, what their vibe is, to then be able to come to the table. We're always up against deadlines, so as much as I can short circuit the process to figure it out on my own, the better. But it's like problem solving, like puzzle solving, like detective work at times.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. One thing I wanted to just double back on for a second, you were talking about working with Lonergan for a particular sound, and you had different ideas even of what that particular sound was. But are there any other instances in which you can think of on projects that you worked on where there would be background effect sounds that might not ever even register to me, the viewer, as I'm watching the scenes, but like that are effects that do evoke something in us?
Yeah, I think like on Severance, for example, as I read the scripts and then I started to see the first few episodes, and then we were coming up with the sound of what it sounds like in Lumen. What does that place sound like? And one of the things that we always put in is room tone. We call it room tone, and it's like the sound of silence in a room. If you were to go, whatever room you're in, if you were to just take a microphone and be quiet and record 3 minutes of the sound of that room in silence, you'll find that there is a baseline wash, a bed of tone that's particular to that room, right? And common things, if it's an office place, you're expecting that there's some computer hum, ventilator hum, whatever, right? Fluorescent lights make a sound. So anyway, so I had this idea that maybe the room tone itself could be made up of human breath, like, I would sample some long breathing and then just make that part of the tone to give this sort of unconscious feeling to the viewer that this place is some sort of sentient, monster that's feeding off of its employees,
Yeah.
And so I had some things like that, and I played them for Ben Stiller and Jeff, the picture editor, And they said, we like the idea, but we don't want to hear that right off the bat. Like that's something as the season progresses and the episodes get more unhinged and things get crazier, maybe that's something that we can work in. So, that's something that we did eventually work in as it got down through the season towards the later episodes. So, that would be an example of something that you don't know, you don't know what it is. There's a sound that I love using. It was a recording of a robin and a robin call, so the chirping of a robin, but I slowed it down. And so it almost sounds like whale, if you've ever heard recordings of whales,
Hmm.
but not the principal sound, the main identifiable sound, but there was one instance in which there was like this cyclical, it's so hard to describe, but it's like this pulsating cyclical sound that was somehow created that was an offshoot to the actual chirp itself that I have been finding myself coming back to that sound for many films because it's really like if you have a situation where a character is experiencing like a vertiginous moment, like a moment where where they're off balance and they're uneasy and they're experiencing some kind of, like queasy emotional agita or something.
Hmm.
That's a sound that I've used and been able to work in with other sounds.
That's interesting. Are there like sound editor secrets to certain sounds that we have Pavlovian responses to, like I don't know, the sound of a school bell or a phone ringing or a siren or so, like that like you can sneak into a scene, sort of knowing that it's going to sort of be acting on our on that subconscious level.
Yeah, I think there are. I know I've done that. I definitely have done that with like dog barks, and there's one dog has a particular melancholy quality, and it's like a dog in an alley, so there's a bit of an echo on it, and I love using that one because it has a little something extra emotionally on it. The same would go for there are these car buys. I know I used it in The Wrestler. But I use them because they have a moaning. It's like the cars going by on a bridge,
Mm.
and there's a moaning quality to that car by.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's something emotional about that. And I love that sound, and I try to get that in whenever I can. And then there's this experience I had working on The Hours with Scott Rudin, where there's a very emotional scene where the uh, character played by Ed Harris, and I think he's dying of AIDS, and he's sitting alone in his apartment, and he's in a lot of pain, and I think there may be some tears coming down his face, and um, and he may be having dialogue with someone I can't remember, but there was a point at which we were in the mix, and Rudin said, and he's not a sound person, right? He's the producer in this
Right.
case, not even the director. But he said, why don't we try putting the sound that a fire engine makes when it's honking, not the siren, but it's like, ah, ah. He said, what if we put that in the background? Do you have that? And I looked through the library, I found that. I put that in, and it had an emotional resonance.
Yeah.
And so that stayed in, and that was, I don't know how he came up with that, but that was, an example of a
So,
sound that has a resonance. As it turned out through trial and error with Wes, I worked on Darjeeling Limited and then on Fantastic Mr. Fox. But on Darjeeling is where I really got to know what he liked and what he didn't like. His visual aesthetic is so rich, and my reflex was to create a component kind of tapestry from sound that was equally rich, that would be like the sonic version of what you were seeing visually. But as it turned out, he expressly did not want that. He didn't want low end. He said low end is like, that's that Hollywood. I don't want a Hollywood, like, like just like glitzy.
What is that? What does that mean? I mean, what is low end?
Low end is low frequency. So if you have an explosion, anything that has like low, and now in stuff you see now, there's lots of great work that's done with low frequency sounds.
Mhm.
But subwoofer sounds, those would be low frequency sounds, or not even subwoofer, but in your main speakers, anything that has that low frequencies in it. The first scene of that movie is Bill Murray is like in this tuk-tuk going through the streets of the city in India. And there's stuff whizzing past him, like sacred cows and other vehicles and people and stuff. And I did that, and I used the full, at that time, 5.1, immersive surround capability to really feel the stuff going past you. And I thought, like, this is great. He's going to love this. And he came in and he sat down and he watched it, and the scene was over, and he got up and he was in a state like he's like, I need to leave. This is not what I want. This is way too much. And he didn't want that dynamic kind of feeling coming from the sound. He said, look, I want documentary sound. I want lo-fi documentary sound where it just sounds really rough and really simple. And that's what I wanted. He said, that's the kind of sound. I don't want the sound to be like what you're seeing visually. I want it just to take that. That's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I think he was right. I think, and then we proceeded accordingly for the rest of the movie. And I think, there was a lot to that, because it's the sound is playing a certain role.
Yeah.
And it allows, I think, as a viewer, it allows you to kind of let the images wash over you in a certain way, and then the sound be more matter of fact, and, do certain kind of like functional things for you. So, and he was right.
Wow. Jacob, it's like unbelievable the amount of nuances, like soup to nuts, that go through the entire profession.
It's a lot. Yeah.
And mostly, if you're doing your job really well, no one will notice, right? Like
that's the goal, that someone goes or watches the movie or the episodic, wherever they are, and they're just taken by the story, and they don't ever think of the sound. And if that's the case, and they love the story, and they tell all their friends, you got to see this movie, and they never talk about the sound, great. Then we've done our job.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's like it's like puzzling things together. I read that the cinematographer Michael Chapman talking about working on Taxi Driver, and he was just like, yeah, everything that we do in cinematography is basically a result of a problem being solved. That's why it looks the way it does, as much as our original artistic intent.
Right. Yeah.
Which is great. Like, anyway, Jacob, this was amazing. Yeah. This was amazing. Thank you so much, brother.
Anytime. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about, what I love doing. And, I could go on and on. So I really do appreciate it.
I mean, is this guy cool or what, right? Did you learn something? All right. Anyway, Jacob, thank you again so much for coming through. It was a real pleasure, as always. It just feels like we've had a continuous banter for 3 decades now. And I'm glad to have shared some of that with my viewers. Once again, thanks to the man in the blue bathrobe for providing the tunes, and John Partham for making sure everything sounds better than decent. This is your boy AB, and I'll catch you soon. All right, peace.